All right, thanks so much. I was just unmuting myself. Thanks for having me. Thanks for very kind introduction, Isaac. And it's really great to present here. I'm very much looking forward to your thoughts. And yeah, without any further ado, let me tell you a bit more about this paper. So, does the melting pot still melt? Internet and immigrants integration. What is this? What is this about? So basically, I want to start this presentation with a picture. So, which basically illustrates a standard view on immigrants, if I may. And this view is literally set in stone in this picture. What it shows is that two main features that we are thinking when we're thinking about immigrants. First, they are uprooted and suffering. They're leaving part of their souls, part of them behind. But also they're determined to succeed at the new place. They look forward, they carry a suitcase, so they want to succeed in a new place. And this is literally the thing that the famous sculptor Bruno Catalano is trying to convey in his art. Today, however, the reality has changed a little bit, and this is something that I'm trying to explore in more detail quantitatively in this paper. And what has changed is basically that today it's much easier to connect across borders than before. So basically the internet, it can change both the suffering. So basically maybe it can allow us to reconnect to those left behind, which can maybe increase our well-being and fill this hole. And on the same time, it can also affect our local success and local integration in a new place, because we can be stuck in our past previous place, all right? And this is just a couple of interviews in a famous paper by Decker and Engberson that were this kind of deep interviews conducted with immigrants, for example, from Ukraine or from Brazil. And all of them say how these new digital technologies basically allow them to reconnect and how they substitute local destination country ties. For example, here, the person is saying that basically there are local friends, but this is a more distant relationship while I connect to my friends via Facebook and Skype and so on. It applies equally, if not more, to refugees. So here is the picture of refugees in Hungary during the famous 2015 so-called refugee crisis, right? And if I were to cite UNHCR, it goes as water, phone, food, in that order, okay? Just to emphasize how important these digital technologies are for immigrants and refugees to stay in touch with those left behind. So basically, as you can already see, what I'm doing in this paper in a nutshell, I'm trying to connect two of the big trends of the last 2-3 decades. The first trend, I guess I don't have to explain in this room, is the increasing immigration, especially from developing to developed countries, which of course puts additional pressure on the questions related to integration. Do immigrants and refugees learn local language? Do they get jobs? Do they rise through the socio-economic ladder? And so on. I mean, look at the last election in the US, the salience of these topics is basically at the all-time high. It basically becomes the first most important, most salient issue, for example, in the US. And the second trend, of course, is the increasing access to new digital technologies, such as Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, and so on. So basically, this increases the availability of network and content from abroad. And immigrants in this context are particularly affected, because now they can easily reconnect to home country peers and media, which usually constitute a large share of their initial network. On the other hand, they can also maybe rely less on the local diaspora in the new place, because let's say 20-30 years ago, that would be the only way to stay in touch with co-nationals. Now you can maybe substitute in-person proximity to digital proximity, all right? And finally, maybe it can fill this hole, right? So maybe it can alleviate this social cost, this cultural cost of relocation. So there are several effects, and I'll try to disentangle them in this paper to understand what is the overall effect of home country internet on immigrants integration. And by the way, the seminar is 1 hour, right? So I guess there would be, I'm totally fine if you interact, and ask questions at any moment in time. That would be maybe even the best as compared to waiting till the end. So if there is a question, just let me know at any point in time, all right? That would be very much appreciated.
Yes.
So to wrap it up, this introduction, so basically what I'm trying to understand in this paper is how does the home country internet access, how does it affect immigrants' social integration, meaning language, naturalization, interethnic marriages, economic success, and overall well-being. So that's the overarching question. Why is it a good idea to look at the home country internet instead of a general internet access? So first, for those who are already at destination, and the focus will be on the US, for those already in the US, home country internet shocks are as good as exogenous. So this will help us to understand the cause and effect in this story. And of course, the home country internet also grants you access to a large part of your network and content, importantly. So that's why I'm focusing on the home country internet. I will try to partial out from my empirical analysis all local shocks that are common to all immigrant groups and focus on the home country internet shocks. If, hopefully, I will convince you that there is an effect of home country internet on immigrants' integration, we will try to understand what is the story here. What is the role of specific mechanisms? What is the change in networking behavior? Maybe people start interacting locally a bit less and switch to online. Maybe return intentions change. So now that your home country is well connected, maybe you simply want to emigrate back to your home country, all right? What is the role of communication versus content? This is still in progress. But all these channels can basically be important. And of course, it's important to note that there are a lot of papers, there is a whole literature in economics, in political science, and sociology, trying to understand what is the local effect of the internet and social media on local economic situation, on voting, on social capital, and so on. So this story is more or less explored. What is less understood, at least to my knowledge, and please educate me further if I'm wrong, that the cross-border effects of the internet are much less understood, especially in the quantitative dimension, how it affects various socioeconomic dimensions of immigrants' integration. So this is what this paper is going to be about. A little roadmap for the talk. So basically, what I'm going to start with, I'm going to document a bunch of stylized facts, if you wish, about changing patterns of immigrants' integration over the last years. I'll be looking at comparing different cohorts of immigrants in the US, what's happening with their language learning, what's happening with their citizenship acquisition, and so on. And importantly, what is also happening with the networking behavior. So how do they interact at destination, and how do they keep ties with the origin, and how these things are changing over the last decades. Then, when we see the broad picture, we will try to basically conduct two empirical exercises, trying to understand what is the role of home country internet. I see these empirical exercises as complementary. So the first would be a bit more suggestive, and we will discuss why is that. The second will be a bit more causal, all right? So the first one, I will be comparing immigrants coming from the same origin country. For example, from Russia to the US. I was born in Russia, right? The control group, I'll say one of the groups, will be arriving in the US with very little internet back at the origin. And the other group, just a few years after, will be arriving with a lot of internet, with, let's say, good internet coverage, large share of people with access to the internet. So I will be comparing these low internet and high internet groups from the same country. And I will be trying to understand how their integration trajectories differ, all right? Of course, with the origin fixed effect, with the cohort bin fixed effect, and all these empirical tools that allow us to improve identification. In the second strategy, instead, I will basically fix the arrival cohort, let's say 2003, and focus on sharp 3G internet arrival. Why 3G? Because it's much sharper. Shocks, usually 3G spreads very fast once first available. And what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be fixing the arrival cohort in the pre-3G era. So let's say all immigrants from all over the world who arrived in the US in 2003. And then different countries and regions are getting treated by 3G in different points in time. So for example, Germany gets 3G in 2006, Russia 2009, Mexico 2011. All right, so this staggered diff and diff design will allow me to basically bring a more causal estimate to the effect of home country internet shocks. And reassuringly, the effects will be comparable in these two strategies, okay? And then, as I said, if we have time, we will try to look into the mechanism. So basically, why exactly do we see a change in immigrants' integration following home country internet expansion? What's happening with the social media usage by immigrants? What's happening with the local networking behavior? What's happening with the return intentions? And so on. you never know when time runs out, so I will preview the main findings. So basically what I see is that high internet arrivals, this kind of first strategy that I previewed, from the same country, people arriving equipped with good internet will show slower social integration. They will improve their linguistic skill over time, but slower than the previous low internet cohorts from the same country. And they will have worse economic outcomes in the long run. Importantly, it's not driven by selection or return migration. So basically, one concern could be that people who come, sorry?
No. Sorry.
Yeah. So basically, one concern could be that people who come, let's say, from Russia to the US before good internet or after good internet is available could be different sorts of people, right? And that's why they integrate differently. That's not the case. So this is not what drives the result, and I will show you how I know that. The second strategy will basically show the same effects. So that basically fixing a given cohort and exploiting these post-migration shocks to fast 3G internet back at the origin. Once your country of origin receives fast internet, linguistic and other measures of integration will slow down. Finally, the most interesting heterogeneity, so basically which kind of subgroups are driving these effects, it will be the low-skilled immigrants, lower educated immigrants. And we will discuss why is that. And also, maybe quite expectedly, younger and family left behind immigrants. So younger groups usually tend to be more active users of these new technologies, and family left behind immigrants have a larger network at the origin. So this reconnection effect is stronger for this group, okay? And as we already discussed, I will show that there will be an increase in the digital time use for immigrants once the home country is connected. So things like calling family, things like time on computers and social media will go up, and local socialization will go down. And also local TV use will go down, which in other papers, it was shown that local time on TV can actually help integration, and people will be substituting away from the TV use towards the internet use. And that's like a green picture, okay? So basically this kind of digital revolution back at the origins, it kind of hurts immigrants' integration, at least in the short run. However, what I also see in the data is that the subjective well-being and also subjective health assessment of immigrants, it actually increases once the home country internet gets available. So basically, even though you kind of integrate slower, at least in the short run, you become happier. So basically now you can reconnect to your friends, now you can reconnect to your home country content, and this is valuable. And people feel happier, even though maybe they are sacrificing a little bit of local success and integration. And importantly, which can maybe have a bearing on the second generation, or let's say longer term effects, that the segregation is going down once home country internet is available. So basically those who arrive already equipped with good home country connectivity, they tend to choose less co-national locations in the US. So let's say 20, 30 years ago, if you come, let's say from Italy, you go to Little Italy. You come from China, you go to Chinatown or something like that. Basically, this share of co-nationals in your first location of choice, it decreases once the home country gets good internet, right? So this maybe in the long run can actually help integration, okay? So this is a paper in a nutshell. Please let me know if there are questions at this point. Yeah, maybe Isaac, yeah.
I want to ask you a question, Alexander, just regarding the concept of home country. Do you mean by home country, you mean the recipient country, like the recipient country of the immigrants?
So I mean the country of birth, the country of birth,
the origin country.
Country of origin, yes.
Okay, yes.
So in the entire analysis, basically, we will distinguish between, let's say, origin or home country and the destination or host country as the receiving, okay? And in all the analysis, the receiving country will be the US, all right? So this will be fixed, okay? The receiving country or the host country will be fixed. And we will be considering different immigrant groups from different home or origin countries, okay?
And initially, the first finding that you mentioned seems counterintuitive for me, but then when you discuss the mechanisms, you mentioned that
Point,
one
sorry,
of the,
which point you mean?
so you mean that high internet arrivals have slower social integration? I
That's
would
correct.
expect the opposite
Mhm.
initially, just based on my
So
preconceptions.
what would be your intuition here? Why would you expect a better integration?
I initially I would thought that if they have better access to internet, they have better access to different tools to have a smoother integration to the recipient country. But then you mentioned that, for example, having this, I don't know, high internet
Yeah,
arrivals reduces your time on TV. I guess that you have more time talking with your relatives in your country of origin. So
precisely.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, so basically the story that I have in mind is that if you arrive already equipped with good internet back at the home country, then basically it allows you to stay in touch basically as if you never left. So you
Yeah.
sacrifice local networking, local language, and this kind of hurts you in the long run, basically.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, indeed, in principle, it can also help because if you already have good internet before migration, maybe it can help you search for better jobs. Maybe it can help you learn language even to begin with, right, before arrival. But basically, we see that if I zoom into small windows around these sharp connectivity expansions, those who arrive just after and just before these expansions, they're pretty much comparable on demographics, on initial language proficiency, and so on. But in the long run, these two groups diverge. And these kind of high internet arrivals, they underperform. I think, Oliver, you have a question.
Yeah, I have a question. It's really interesting. Just wondering about the use of ICTs and connections because they come from a home country where they've got access now to internet or they move. Now, do you have evidence on how far they are changing their connections to their to the wider network of their compatriots, whether within the country, within the destination country, or possibly a wider sort of diasporic network, which has been opened up by communication? I mean, that's the sort of thing I know that Gottfried Egenbergson and Jan Decker were looking at. It was a lot of that in their study. So I just wonder if you've got anything on where they're actually connecting.
Via internet, you mean, right? Via the internet. So it's not so easy, of course, to see, right? Because this is the aggregate measure. So I'm working now with the Facebook data that basically allows me to track region to region connectivity. This is still work in progress, but that would be fantastic to see whether they connect, let's say, to specific, let's say, locations where they have their family, okay? Or they connect generally to, let's say, home country YouTube, which is kind of country level thing, right? It's not attached to a particular region, right? So
Yeah.
that would be perfect, of course, to see in the data, but it's still in progress. So basically, yeah.
So certainly in terms of language, it could be that by having the practice of connection in the home country, when you move, you continue that. The center of gravity of who you're connecting with might shift to the destination, but you're still in a language bubble, which means you're less likely to pick up the language.
Exactly. So that generally was the story that I had in mind, that basically the opportunity to remain in this language bubble, it increases with the home country. So I think I totally agree with what you're saying. Yeah. But thanks for this. I agree that having a more precise measure would be perfect, but you have to start somewhere. So yeah, good. Okay, let me know if there are other questions. Otherwise, I will keep going. Okay, so where briefly before we go into the data, where this paper falls in the literature, at least that I'm familiar with. So basically, three main strands of research. So first, there is of course a huge literature on immigrants integration, assimilation, and so on. We know that, country of origin and the cohort of arrival is important. We know that selection into migration can affect future success. We know that language learning is important, citizenship is important, and so on. I'm not even trying to review all this literature. I think the new thing that this paper shows is that basically it adds these home country internet shocks to the picture, and it shows how it affects employment, language, citizenship. So all these factors that were found to be important in the broader literature. Then there is, as I briefly mentioned, there is a separate literature on the local effects of new technologies, on the labor markets, on voting, on populism, on social capital, on networking, and so on. This paper adds the cross-border effects of the internet on immigrants, which I think is relatively new. And finally, there is a large literature on the effects of co-national networks, which I'm sure many people here are very familiar with. But basically, usually what this literature does, it looks at the size of the network of the diaspora destination, or like the dimensions of quality or interactions with this diaspora. What this paper does, it basically shows that maybe in the digital age, where we have basically the access to online diaspora, if you wish, maybe the importance of local destination country co-nationals, it can actually go down, because we don't have to be physically close to the diaspora anymore. So that would be another important message from this paper. Okay, so, but later on, maybe, or even now, let me know if you think that this paper can connect to other branches of research. So let's start with the broad observations on the recent changes in the networking behavior and time use. How do we measure integration? Well, I guess you will not fall from your chairs looking at these measures. So basically, I go to the American Community Survey, which is the repeated cross-section data available for many, many years. And I look at immigrants, actually now it's from 1991 to 2019 arrivals. What do I measure? What indicators of integration and assimilation do I use? That would be the language skill, naturalization rate, spatial and occupational segregation, economic success, and interethnic marriages, which is still in progress. So pretty much the standard bundle of integration outcomes, all right? I will be focusing on the first generation immigrants today, so basically those who were born abroad instead of children of immigrants. And to preview a little bit basically on these second generation immigrants, the effects are either much weaker or completely null, depending on the measure. How do we measure integration specifically? How do we conceptualize? What is the model of integration that I have in mind? Well, the basic model, at least in the literature that I'm most familiar with, is that you measure a given outcome, let's say linguistic skill, for an immigrant I coming from country O, living in a given state or county in the US, index S, observed in a given year T, who arrived in the US in the cohort or year M, okay? And what is the integration profile? We basically will measure the years since migration, YSM, which is equals to T minus M. So how many years have you spent in the US? And I will allow a very flexible specification. So for each year since migration, I will allow for a separate fixed effect to determine how much your linguistic skill improves, or how much more likely you are to get citizenship, or to get employment, and so on. And the standard integration profile will look something like that. So basically, the more years you spend at destination in the US, the better, for example, your linguistic skill becomes, with like a convex log-like profile. All right, so that's the standard integration profile. Not much new here just yet. And importantly, I will also allow for locality cross-time fixed differences to be partialed out from this analysis. So basically, local internet access, for example, in the US, or local labor market shocks, or local integration policies, everything that is common for all immigrants in a given location, this will be stripped out from this regression. And importantly, I will also difference out fixed effects at the country level, country of origin level, and fixed effect at the cohort of arrival bin. Why bin? Because I want to avoid perfect collinearity with the year since migration. If you have a year fixed effect, year since migration, and cohort of arrival, you cannot have all of them and not drop one of these dimensions, because it becomes just too many fixed effects. So I will bin the cohort of arrival years into 5-year bins, okay? So that's the empirical design, broadly speaking. And these beta T minus M fixed effects, as I showed here, So these are these fixed effects. They will show us how fast people integrate by language, by employment, by citizenship. Pick your favorite measure, okay? Already here in these integration profiles, we can see that if I split arrival cohorts into these 5-year bins, we see that earlier arrivals, late 90s, early 2000s, they integrate much faster than the more recent cohorts. All right, we see that they improve, all cohorts improve their linguistic skill, but the recent cohorts are a little bit shifted downwards, okay? So we see that the recent cohorts integrate linguistically, and also in the paper, you can look at my website, there is a paper posted, you will see that for other outcomes, integration has also slowed down. So already here we see that something is happening, that basically recent cohorts are integrating slower, okay? Why is this happening? Maybe there is a change in the networking behavior of more recent cohorts. Can we actually see that? So basically to see what people do with their time, I go to a different data set, which is called the American Time Use Survey. It has a slightly smaller time span from 2003 to 2019. And I can measure things like how much time do you call your family back at the origin? How much time do you spend socializing with in the neighborhood? How much time do you spend on computers, on TV, and so on? And for example, already here, we see that immigrants who are the red lines here, we see that calling family or time on computers increases sharply over the recent decades, and much more, especially for calls to the family than for the locals, for Americans. We see that both groups, for example, spend more time on computers for leisure, games, social media, but in relative terms, the increase for immigrants is much larger. And also keep in mind that the values are relatively small here, but there are a lot of zeros, especially for calls. This is just one day. So basically people receive diaries that they feel what they do with their time, and there are many zeros in this random day. If you drop zeros, these values are much, much larger, of course, and here as well. So basically the differences are actually very large. Okay, and what does this increase come at the expense of? It comes at the expense of local socialization. So we see that measures such as socialization and leisure with non-household members, or time spent in like neighborhood homes, all these things are decreasing particularly strongly for immigrants, but for natives as well. But again, in the paper, I show that the difference between immigrants and Americans, it's increasing over time, okay? Especially if I partial out more controls and so on, such as demographics and so on, okay? So this is just to tell you that basically something is happening over the recent years with the pace of integration and with the networking behavior, okay? Let me know if there are questions to these broad patterns, and again, more details are available in the paper. But basically, the main part of the paper, what I do, I try to understand whether origin country or home country internet changes, whether they are responsible for changing patterns of integration. Let's start with the first empirical approach. As I said, I have two. The first empirical approach will basically, it is motivated by the literature showing that what is happening upon arrival to the immigrants is crucial for subsequent success. There is a long line of papers showing that there are like sensitive years, basically, for immigrants' integration. And what is happening upon arrival is basically this sensitive period. So what I'm going to be doing in this first strategy is the following. I will compare high internet versus low internet arrivals from the same country. I will take data from the International Telecommunications Union on the share of people with broadband internet access. I will zoom into small time windows around sharp internet expansions. And I will compare high internet versus low internet arrivals in these small bins from the same country. So as I said, I will include origin and cohort bin fixed effects, okay? Just to illustrate, for example, take South Korea and internet expansion there. We can define, of course, different thresholds of what it means to have good internet. Here I use the 50% threshold just as an example. Usually the internet expansion is the fastest, around like 30 to 50% threshold. So the control group, the control arrivals for South Korea would be these guys who arrived with close to zero internet. And the treated group will be these guys who arrived just a few years after from the same country, but already with 60 to 80% coverage. Not in all the cases, the expansion is so fast. For example, if you take Russia, it's a bit more gradual, but still you see this expansion period over here. Yeah. And I will take these cohorts from Russia as low internet and these cohorts from Russia as high internet. So very similar arrival years, but very different digital environments back in the home country. You may be concerned that, let's say, these guys from Russia who arrive in 2008, 2009, they are getting treated a few years after, right? Because Russia is increasing its internet access, and these guys will also get good internet in a few years. To avoid this thing, I will kind of move back the control group in the alternative robustness exercise. So this will be the control group. These guys are not having much of an internet like 5 to 9 years after arrival, all right? And the treatment group will remain the same. So I will be making this comparison, holding fixed the the origin country, and varying the year of migration. Yes, please, Isaac.
Yes, so that's the question that I have. Why are you varying the year of migration? Why you don't pick as the initial point for South Korea and Russia, I think 1995 to 1997, let's say? Why do you say that in Russia you pick different years as control?
So basically, the definition of a treatment and control group is based on the internet expansion in a given country, right? So for example, for South Korea, there is a fast internet expansion around year 2000, right?
Yes.
So we see that basically there is almost no internet here and a lot of internet here, right?
Yes.
So it makes sense to compare these guys who arrived with little internet and these guys who arrived with a lot of internet, and they're very similar in terms of the arrival cohorts, right? So it's just 3-4 years apart, okay?
Yes.
But in Russia, if I compare in the same period, there is no difference, basically, right? These guys have zero internet, and these guys also have pretty much zero internet, right? So for Russia, the more meaningful comparison is around the fast expansion period, which is later, all right? And also it gives me more variation. I can, for example, I can insert the overall cohort fixed effect. Let's say those who arrived between 1997 and 2002, something like that. And within this group, I will have countries with zero coverage and countries with some variation, all right? So basically, this gives me much more variation.
So this is just to keep all cases within the 5-year window.
Correct. So basically, I will have, let's say, South Korean case, and the only observations that I will keep will be in this shaded area for South Korea. But for Russia, the only observations I will keep will be in the blue shaded area, all right? And then for some other country, for example, I don't know, let's say for Italy, it will be somewhere in between, okay? Because the internet expansion for Italy will be happening somewhere around here, okay? In the early 2000s. So that will be the design, okay? So how I'm going to use this high internet indicator? I'm basically going to compare these integration coefficients. Remember them from the previous pictures, right? So basically these integration profiles, right? And I will see how these integration profiles differ based on this high versus low internet status upon arrival, okay? So that's what we're going to be doing. So we're going to see how these integration coefficients differ, how they interact with the high internet upon arrival status. Of course, we can define what it means to have good internet. Is it 50% with access? Is it 25? Is it maybe speed of connectivity? So I do various robustness checks with respect to that, and the effects remain pretty much intact. Of course, you may be concerned with several things. For example, are people comparable to begin with, those who arrive with good or bad internet? Or maybe the size of the migration flows changes to begin with internet expansion. I do not see much of this effect, by the way. Or maybe there is differential return intention or return migration once the home country gets good internet. I also show in the paper in more detail that this is not much of a concern. Okay? So what do we see? Oh yeah, and here I show that basically on this 5-year window sample, for example, around 50% threshold, there is no difference upon observables. So education, employment, other demographics, or starting level of English, they are no different between high versus low internet arrivals from the same country. Okay, so basically people are very much comparable. But they arrive comparable, as you can see here, no difference in, for example, linguistic skill or naturalization dynamics. But in the long run, high internet cohorts, they show much lower levels of English proficiency and much lower chances to get citizenship, and also much lower employment and wages, as I show in the paper. So basically a bunch of integration outcomes suffers from arriving equipped with good home country internet. Note that, for example, in citizenship, there is no difference in the first 5-6 years since arrival, because usually in the US, you cannot get citizenship in the first several years. You need to spend some time, and then the differences kick in once you're eligible. Okay? So we see that across these integration outcomes, if you arrive equipped with good home country internet, there is a penalty on your integration outcome. Okay? So this is the first, let's say, main result, that social and economic integration as well slows down for high internet arrivals. How large are these effects? For example, here you can see that you're like 5 to 7% less likely to get citizenship in the long run. But what does it mean to have like 0.08 less English proficiency? Well, basically, it's a 20% slowdown for high internet cohorts. So if you remember this kind of increasing integration profile, it shifts down by 20% for high internet arrivals from the same country. Okay. The other way to measure it is basically this kind of 0.08 long run drop that we see in this picture. This 0.08 units is approximately quarter of a standard deviation of cross-country differences in linguistic skill. So if I pull all immigrants in the US and measure their linguistic skill, this 0.08 is 1/4 of a standard deviation of the variation across all. So pretty large effect.
Can I ask you a question here?
Yes, please.
It's just, how do you know, if I've understood this correctly, how do you know that this is concerned with the home country internet? Because you're always talking about a shift over time.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about, you know, a few years back, and then more recently, whether it's South Korea or it's Russia. And I imagine there has been a shift in the way that people are using the internet in terms of language skills. You don't need language so much now. You use Google Translate. You know, all those things. The way you use technology changes the need for those skills. So I'm just wondering, how do you know it's about that connection with the home that really matters?
Well, first of all, because I measure directly, right, the share of people with access to the internet back at the origin in your arrival period, right? And also I difference out all other changes across countries that are fixed over time. And also I difference out all general changes in technology, as you say. Mm-hmm. So everything that changes with time, and that is common to all immigrant groups.
Right.
This will be differenced out. So for example, if there is an emergence of Duolingo, or if there is an emergence of Google Translate, or if there is a change in, let's say, online jobs, generally, if it becomes a thing, okay? But if these changes are common to all groups, this will be consumed by these fixed effects, all right? So what I'll be measuring here is the differential change specific to a given home country. So like we look, for example, back in this figure, right? So let's say in 2000 or like 96, South Korea was not online, okay? If you arrive in 2006, you cannot connect back to your home country, at least not as much as afterwards. If you arrive just a few years after, in 2002, everyone in South Korea is online.
Yes.
So this allows you to communicate better. All right.
Okay.
Same here. Yep.
That's fantastic. That helps. I don't know enough of the techniques to follow it completely, but I get where you're coming from.
No, but that's important question. Maybe also what you have in mind is that, let's say, the change for the South Korea from here to here is not the same as the change for Russia from here to here. Because basically when Russia gets good internet in 2010 or whatever, there are more digital technologies in this time period, right? So that would be the interaction effect, right? That maybe what you're saying is that you would expect a stronger effect for the Russian shock, for Russians, than for the South Koreans back in the day, right? Because basically, let's say in 2001, the Facebook is not there yet, the Skype is only getting there. So maybe this shock would be weaker for South Korean case, right? Is that close a little bit to what you have in mind?
Well, that's also part of it as well. And it's just still this question about the way it's connected to the homeland, the country of origin, because there's so much going on within the US.
Yes, so everything that is common to the US, as I mentioned briefly,
you've taken out, you say, yes.
Yes, exactly, precisely. It will be taken out from this regression. Yes. Okay,
thanks.
Yep. I will just write it down real fast. Okay. So indeed. So all the common shocks to the US and all the common shocks to a given time period, they will be partialed out, and we will focus on the home country changes in the internet environment. Now, yes, as I said, there is a slowdown in this empirical approach that we observe, that basically high internet arrivals underperform in terms of social or economic integration, and the effect is pretty large. On the other hand, as I previewed in the introduction, what I also see is that there is a decrease in co-national concentration spatially. So basically, you are less likely to go to the enclave residence in the US if you arrive already equipped with home country internet. So this is a large table. I don't, of course, will not go through all the specifications, but basically what I show here is that the share of co-nationals in your first county of choice, your first location in the US, decreases if you arrive after your home country reached 50% coverage or simply with more people online, okay? No matter what is the specification, there is something like a 10% drop in the share of connationals in your first location of choice. So basically there is like a desegregation effect of home country internet, okay? So this can be like a force maybe for more integration in the long run. I do a bunch of robustness for this first empirical approach, and the results are pretty much stable for this thing. Maybe also towards what Oliver was saying, there are many correlated changes, let's say in development levels or in political environment back at the origin that can be correlated with changes in the internet environment. So one of the robustness checks that I do is that I ensure that basically, let's say, changes in GDP per capita or in political institutions, or let's say in corruption, these things that can correlate with the digital revolution back at the origin, they do not change the negative effect. At least they do not change it much, the negative effect of home country internet. So we see that basically, as you spend more and more years since migration in the US, let's say your linguistic proficiency is improving. This is basically the slope of this integration curve. And the slope gets smaller if you arrived equipped with good internet. And this result is not shaken basically at all by the inclusion of these additional variables at the home country, be it development or political institutions, and so on. And this is not surprising in a way, because basically, as we saw, these changes in the internet, they are very sharp, much faster than, let's say, development or whatever, democratic changes and so on, at least usually. All right. So that's the first strategy, right? What do I do in the second part of the analysis? In this case, I will basically be looking at the expansion of 3G internet. which is much faster, as I show in this graph. Basically in 2003, 2004, let's say Germany has basically almost zero 3G. And then by 2005 or 2006, I should say, there is almost a complete coverage. Again, the speed can vary, but basically a lot of people very fast get access to this fast mobile internet. And the expansion of this technology varies by country, right? So what I'm going to be doing in this second strategy, I will look at immigrants who arrived in the US in this pre-3G time period. So let's say 2003, okay? And then Germany is getting treated in 2006, Mexico 2009, let's say Philippines or whatever, Guatemala a bit later, and so on. So basically, very sharp shocks. We know that 3G and 4G basically puts people online on the social media. Today, basically 80 or more % of the social media is associated with mobile devices. So we know that these 3G and 4G technologies are very important. And what do I do here? I basically go to a given country, let's say Mexico. I have these 3G coverage maps and population maps, and I aggregate these maps to see what is the share of your home country or your home region that is covered by 3G. Let's say in 2010, only Mexico City is covered and other regions are not, close to zero. But by 2020, a lot of regions are differentially treated by this 3G access, all right? And what I'm going to be doing, as I said, I will fix a given arrival cohort, pre-3G, let's say 2003, and then I will run a staggered diff and diff design. So basically, staggered adoption of this 3G technology across countries. And I will pool different 3G cohorts with cohort fixed effect. And what do I see? I see that there is basically across different empirical approaches, I see that there are no difference across countries, no different dynamics of integration before 3G shock. And then once the 3G arrives, there is a downward pressure on linguistic skill, and same with naturalization. So basically, once your home country gets good, fast 3G or 4G internet, your linguistic skill deteriorates as compared to countries that have not yet got good 3G coverage, all right? So that's the second strategy, and basically the result is pretty much the same, but using different sort of variation here. Okay, and importantly, the whole effect here is driven by early treated. So those who are getting this home country 3G treatment early on, post-arrival. So basically in the first 5 years is the crucial sensitive period. If you receive good 3G later on in your tenure in the US, then there is basically almost no effect on your integration dynamics. Okay? So these are basically the main results, all right? And in the remaining few minutes, I will just show a little bit of heterogeneity, so which groups drive these effects and the mechanisms, okay? I don't have much time, so the biggest heterogeneity, all right, by far, is that the whole slowdown, like on this graph, is driven by lower educated, lower skilled immigrants. So basically for the high school and college dropouts, there is a lot of slowdown. For college educated or higher, there is absolutely no effect of home country internet. And basically, I show a little bit more evidence in the paper, but apparently it's driven by this idea that high-skilled immigrants, so those for whom I do not observe much of an effect, high-skilled immigrants, they are getting exposure to language, exposure to natives on the job. So they're taking high-skilled jobs, so they learn language, they build networks anyway at the job. If you're a low-skilled immigrant, you're more likely to work as a taxi driver or as a cleaning lady or as a construction worker, and you are more likely than not to be surrounded by other immigrants or generally not have much of a linguistic exposure at a job. And so basically this kind of home country internet shocks, they have much larger bite for this group, okay? So at least that's the interpretation that I currently have. I also see that the effects are stronger for Hispanic populations. They're stronger for younger populations. and are stronger for languages with large online presence. All right, so these effects are also there. Okay. What are the mechanisms behind these effects? So can we actually document changes in behavior that can explain why there is a slowdown in integration? To basically do this, I first document that once the home country gets good internet, there is a drop in traditional phone calls. So basically these non-internet based phone calls, which were very expensive, as you probably know, these phone calls, they drop in their popularity. And what increases instead is the social media usage. So basically Facebook, especially for countries with high immigration, especially for these countries, there is an increase in social media, particularly Facebook usage, much less so for low net immigration countries. And what happens with the time use of treated immigrants? They decrease their time on local socialization in the US. So here, for example, I measure time spent on local socialization and communication outside of the household. And basically, once your country receives 3G, there is not much of a change before that, but after your country gets 3G, your time on local socialization goes down. So basically, you spend less and less time in the neighborhood and more time online. For example, here I show the time on family calls increases, and I also have a similar table with time on like social media and computer usage. These things go up. Yeah? So basically, digital time increases and time on local socialization goes down. So this is one of the mechanisms. I do not see much of an effect on return intentions. So basically, there could be two stories here, right? On the one hand, it's harder to leave the home country behind if it gets good internet, so maybe you want to go back. And this can hurt your integration in the US. On the other hand, you can stay in touch without going back once you have Skype, WhatsApp, and so on. So in principle, the effect can go either way. And if anything, I do not find much of an effect. If anything, it's a little bit negative. So basically, once internet coverage increases back in the home country, you are less likely, a little bit, not even significantly, less likely to report wanting to go back. So apparently that's not a mechanism that you just want to go back. This is not the story. The story is the change in the networking behavior that we saw in the time use data here and here. All right. So that seems to be the main thing. I also find, as I briefly mentioned, just to mention in the remaining couple of minutes, that basically subjective well-being of immigrants increases in contrast to the integration. So here, very similar design to the second empirical approach. So I look at the post-migration shocks to home country internet, and what I see is that once the home country 3G is available, there is a bump up in the subjective well-being of immigrants. So basically, these are variables such as, do you feel happy? How do you assess your quality of life? How do you assess your mental health? And these sort of things. So all of these measures, they improve following home country internet access and not before, okay? So there seems to be an interesting trade-off here. On the one hand, you kind of become happier once your home country connects to the internet. On the other hand, your local integration at the destination country suffers. So there is an interesting trade-off here. So what have we learned from this paper? So basically, the way that I see it is that it's kind of this bird's eye view documentation of new facts on the linkages between home country internet expansion and immigrants integration. What I see is that overall, there is a negative effect of home country internet access on immigrants integration for linguistic skill, naturalization, and economic success. On the other hand, we see lower spatial concentration and improved subjective well-being. And the effects seems to be driven by lower skilled immigrants. All right, so this kind of increases the disparities further between low skilled and high skilled immigrants. And the mechanism seems to be changes in the networking behavior. So what people do with their time. They spend much more time online, much more time on like Skype and Facebook and much less time in the neighborhood, much less time on local socialization once home country internet is there. So thanks for your attention. Let me know if there are any other questions. I'm happy to talk. But yeah, that's what I have for today. Thanks so much.